In the small town of Morrisville, known for its old textile factory, a legend began to resurface about the mysterious Weaver, a being that appears at night and drags people into its web. It was said to return every 50 years, once the old generation had passed and the new one had forgotten to fear it. Rumors spread about strange disappearances in Morrisville. At the scenes, only intricate patterns of fine threads remained, hanging from ceilings, walls, and furniture. No one knew what the creature was or why it took people, but they all agreed on one thing. You couldn't see it until it was too late. Jane, a 22-year-old college student, had just returned home for the holidays. Her parents were away for a couple of days, leaving her alone in their large but eerie house. That night, she heard an odd sound, something scratching softly against the walls. Peering out the window, she noticed something unusual in the moonlight. A tall, stretched figure standing in the shadows of the trees behind the house. Its outline seemed unnaturally thin, with long, spindly limbs. In its hands, it held a spool of thread that slowly unraveled. The creature appeared to be staring directly at her. Convincing herself it was just a trick of the light, Jane returned to her bedroom. But as she lay in bed, the room grew unnaturally cold. She heard a faint creak, like something moving across the ceiling. Looking up at the light fixture, she noticed thin, nearly invisible threads dangling down, slowly lowering toward her. Reaching for the light switch, she froze as the threads abruptly tightened and wrapped around her wrist. At first, they seemed harmless, delicate, like cobwebs. But as they began to constrict, their edges sliced into her skin, razor sharp. Jane screamed, trying to pull free, but the threads moved with a life of their own. One coiled tightly around her ankle, another around her arm, pulling her toward the dark corner of the room where the ceiling seemed unnaturally shadowed. Desperate, Jane grabbed a knife from her nightstand and slashed at one of the threads. A high-pitched screech echoed from the darkness, and the threads released her. She collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The next morning, Jane visited the town's old archivist, Mr. Grayson, hoping to find answers. Grayson, visibly nervous, explained the legend of the Weaver. "It's an ancient being, Jane," he said. "It comes for those who are alone in their homes, especially old ones, where the walls remember the past. The Weaver traps its victims with threads. First, it observes them, and then it begins to weave its web around them. But its web doesn't just trap, it drains the life out of you. The more you struggle, the faster it consumes your strength." Grayson showed her old newspaper clippings. The photographs of homes where people had vanished were covered in the same fine threads Jane had seen. Hoping it was all just a nightmare, Jane returned home. But the house felt different. Heavier, colder. The smell of dust hung in the air, mixed with something damp and metallic. Thin threads now hung from the chandelier in the living room. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to thicken. Jane heard a faint whispering, like voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Then, it emerged from the darkness. The creature was humanoid, but grotesquely distorted. Its limbs too long, its fingers sharp like needles. Its face was obscured by a mask that resembled burlap, and threads spilled out from beneath it, moving like living things. The Weaver lunged at her, and the threads wrapped around her body again. This time, they didn't just cut her skin. They began to drain her warmth. Jane felt the cold seep deeper, as if her blood had stopped flowing. She remembered Grayson's warning. Don't move too suddenly. Find the source of the web, the spool. Without it, it can't complete the ritual. Summoning her remaining strength, Jane scanned the room. In the corner, near the wall, she spotted a shiny black spool of thread, the center of the web. She grabbed a candle from the mantel and lit it. The flames licked at the threads, which sizzled and shrank away. The Weaver let out a piercing shriek, a sound so intense that Jane had to cover her ears. The creature lunged for the spool, trying to protect it, but Jane had already set the connecting threads on fire. The flames raced along the web, consuming it. The weaver's limbs began to unravel into thin strands, which burned and disintegrated in the fire. With one final desperate cry, it dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. The next morning, Jane found only charred remains of threads scattered around the house. Her arms and legs bore deep cuts from the threads, but she was alive. Meeting with Grayson again, she recounted what had happened. He listened intently, but gave her a grim warning. "The Weaver never truly dies," he said. "It will return when people forget."